Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here. A little nervous, too. Thanks for the encouragement. So I wanted to start off by asking you guys a question. What are some ways that we as Americans have an advantage socially, politically, and religiously? Freedom. And freedom in what ways? Rights. Free to express our religion. Access to resources. So, for example, we can get passports, we can get ID cards, we can travel, we can go abroad. All of these things are some of the advantages that we have in our day-to-day life as Americans. So my second question is, what do you see as major discrepancies in our lives as Americans, socially, politically, and religiously? Because there are discrepancies, right? Socially, our lives are different than what the politics say, and then also our religion, the major dominant religion in this country, Christianity basically has other views as well that is a discrepancy between the other two. So what do you think? This is not going as planned if you're not going to answer the questions.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure.
What are the discrepancies?
What are the discrepancies that are there between our social lives and political, basically politics, the legal law, the law and stuff that it says, and also religiously? What do you think that are some discrepancies? Yeah.
Geographic, rural areas are more conservative and Christian than cities?
Yeah, so geographically, there are rural areas that are more conservative than the urban areas.
Well, and I think within each of the categories that you defined, there's sort of a dominant class, and there's always, like, within discrepancies, I think you can think about power distributions, and so there's a dominant class that tends to hold access to a lot of resources, and then you sort of have different tiers beneath that with less access and less power.
Yes. So all the things that you have said are discrepancies in our day-to-day lives, socially, politically, and religiously. Rural areas, the urban areas, there's a major difference between them. What she said about, the dominant class and the social hierarchy, basically. So my project was about the Khwaja Sara culture in Pakistan. And Khwaja Sara is a term that has many different meanings behind it. Khwaja Sara can mean transgender, it can mean intersex. It basically means someone that is not identified as the binary male or female. So if a person, if it was a cross-dresser, if it was a person that just was more feminine, a man that was more feminine, they would all be known as Khwaja Sara. And it's a culture, it's an identity, it's how they are perceived, not just by society, but also how they portray themselves. So the first aspect that I wanted to talk about was their social lives. And the biggest person, or the person that I met, that she was the first person that I interviewed when I was in Pakistan, and this was in Karachi. So what you said, even in in America, when there are rural areas and there are urban areas, there are differences between that, and I wanted to focus on how it is different within the culture if a person is living within the city or outside the city, and in more of in their villages and more in their cultural ingrained lands. So this is Sonia's quote. She said, "I wouldn't wish this fate on my enemies." And she continuously said this again and again during her, when I was asking her. And so I wanted to show you a quick video. Oh, it started.
हम लोग कहाँ जाएं? हम भी तो दुनिया की मखलूक हैं। दुनिया में क्या पड़ा है? हमारे दिन से कुछ हम कितने धक्के खा रहे हैं। हम तो कहते हैं ये दुआ करते नमाज पढ़ के अल्लाह ताला बारी ताला मदीने वाले हमारे जैसा खदड़ा किसके घर जो हमें लानत देते हैं उसके घर भी पैदा न करिए जैसे हम जिंदगी गुजार रहे हैं हमें पता ही हमारे अल्लाह को पता तो थप्पड़ मार रहे गाली दे
फिर लोग छेड़ते हैं रोडों पे जाते हैं आप लोग आते हैं देखते हैं बदतमीजियां करते हैं
क्या करें जिंदगी तो गुजारनी है ना ठीक है मुझे कहती मेरी बेटी भी बेटा भी उसने मुझे चार था वो बचाया ना, तो भाई मेरा गला भी काटने तक था। मुझे याद नहीं रहेगा जब उन्होंने मुझे मारा पीटा सब कुछ किया। अब कहाँ का आपको मैं निशान दिखाऊं। और एक दिन मेरे घर हो गया भतीजा पैदा, उधर खदड़े आके बधाई लेने के लिए। उन लोगों ने मुझे देख लिया क्योंकि मैंने सर पे दुपट्टा ओढ़ा हुआ था, करके काम कर रही थी। उनका भी ये कौन है? मेरी अम्मी ने कहा ये मेरा बेटा। उसने कहा ये बेटा थोड़ी खदड़ा है।
उसमें उन्होंने पहचान लिया।
उन्होंने मुझे पहचान लिया।
तो वो ऐसे उठा के लेकर आ सकते?
ऐसे उठा के नहीं ले आए, प्यार मोहब्बत से लेके आए। ऐसे कौन उठा के ले जा सकता है? मेरे बहन को पैर नहीं मारते थे। मैं कसाई कौम की हूँ।
कि अम्मी से बात करी,
अम्मी से बात करी, उन्होंने बोला ले जाओ। ये प्रॉमिस करो ये मेरे मुझे मिलता रहे। मैंने बोला सही। वो तो मुझे देखना नहीं चाहते हो कि तू कहते हो एक दफा तुमने मुझे पैर मार दिया था।
ये किस वजह से ऐसे?
इसका ये खदड़ा इसको हम लोग इधर घर में मार देते जड़े ना ले जाए। तो मैं इससे थोड़ा सा बड़ा था। वो तो मुझे बिल्कुल देख कर वो मेरी मामियाँ देख के यूँ कर लेती मुझे, कभी अम्मी से मिलने जाऊँ तो मैं कहते तो दफा।
और क्या, सही बात।
मैं तो ये दुआ करता हूँ मुझे अब इतना दे कि अपनी अम्मी को अजुम्बरा करा लो, बड़े फिर मैं मर जाऊँ। मैं तो झूठ बोलती नहीं, मर्दाने कपड़े पहन लेती, बाल फोल्ड कर लेती, साफे की साफा बांध लेती, जुम्मे की नमाज पढ़ के आ जाती। नमाज तो मुसलमान में वाजिब है ना। अल्लाह मियाँ तुझे बेटा दे। वो 1.5 साल मिले, साल बाद मिले, वो पहचान लेती फिर मुझे। इधर मैं 14 साल से मांग रही हूँ, सोनिया मेरा नाम है। तो मुझे अपना जो उनका मेरा होता है मुझे दे जाती। मैं बच्चों को लोरी भी इधर दे देती, ये घर बुला ले तो उधर जाके डांस भी कराते हैं, जो नसीब को उधर ले भी आते हैं।
पहले ऐसे बधाइयाँ वगैरह पे ज्यादा जाते थे आप लोग, अब ये नहीं
अब
होता
ये
इतना।
नहीं है ना।
तो आपको वो ज्यादा बेहतर लगता है, ये ज्यादा बेहतर है?
वो अच्छा था, इधर तो बस क्या करेगा। अरे समझो हमारी जिंदगी में गुजरेगी। मैं अम्मी से मिलने जाती हूँ, गुरु किराया देता, कपड़े बनवा के देता, मेरी अम्मी के भी कपड़े बनवा के देता है। उसने मुझे इतना 1.5-2 तोले सोना बना के दिया गुरु ने। बैंक बैलेंस है मेरा उसके पास, मेरा ID कार्ड बना हुआ है अपने वालिद और वालदा के नाम से।
Okay, so this video was Sonia, and she hits a lot of stuff in her day-to-day life. She says she has an ID card. She says that when she grew up, her childhood was extremely, she faced a lot of abuse from her brothers, her family. And another thing that she said was that she goes to pray disguising herself as a man, so that it's easier for her to go pray. She didn't choose this life. Obviously, she was born an intersex individual. She was taken away from her family on the promise that she can continue to meet them afterwards. And so she still lives in poverty. She begs on the streets, and that was in front of Meena Bazaar. This is Almas Bobi. That was in Karachi. This is in Islamabad. This is an area in Islamabad where wealthy people have a really hard time finding homes. And so it's a standard, and Almas Bobi is a transgender individual as well. I don't know why this slide is not going.
And you know what?
Oh.
We'll perfect this by the time we finish. Can you just please sit over here? Thanks.
I'm just going next, and it's like slowly going away. I hope I get extra time for this.
Go.
Okay. So she has her name outside of her mansion, and it's in an area where it's really expensive as well. So this is Bobby House. She's been on TV. Is this gonna do this again?
That's fine. Keep talking.
Okay. So this is Bobby House. We can just show it like this too. It's fine. This is the outside of her home, which has a lawn, which is a luxury that a lot of people don't have. This is the inside, the interior of her home, which was like a Mughal museum, basically, with artifacts, paintings, and pictures. And she had people from the local madrasa or Islamic school come in and do like a Quran reading in her home for blessings. And so in Pakistan, the people that are transgender or intersex, they're considered as somewhat of a divinity. They're revered in a way that if they curse someone or if they say something to somebody, it's like taken as their word. So if they pray for someone, it's like, oh, I met a family and they had a son born like 26 years ago, and I was asking this lady, why do you think, why do you respect them so much? And she was like, oh, because they prayed and I got a son. And I was like, okay. And so whenever they are in the rural areas, they acquire so much wealth in one way by saying that this is mine. So they'll go into a village and they'll look at a cow and they'll put their hand on that cow and say, this cow is mine. And then the people that own that cow don't have any other option, because they think if they don't give this cow over, their entire herd or their entire farm will be cursed. And so that's why they give it over. Whenever they do come to like an event, an occasion, a child's birth, they're asked to dance. And they are also presented with like the best china, with like the best seating area, because they're kind of feared in a way as well, that their word might be the word of like God, or the word, their prayers will be heard directly. And so this is, it was ironic that she had someone come in and do this reading in her home. This is Osabuohien's house, the interior of her house, and then the next one. This is a painting that she had, which is grand. This is Osabuohien herself. So she didn't choose this life either. She was born in London. She was born as an intersex person. She came over to Pakistan when she was 9 years old, and from then on, she's been an advocate for the transgender community and trying to fight for their rights. And she was a major person in having the law made for her ID, for the ID cards that was passed, that they can have male, female, or another option under the ID card so they can identify themselves. But Osabuohien, now, a lot of people that I've spoken to in the intersex community, they've said that we don't relate with her anymore because fame has gotten to her head, direct quote from some of the people. But she's still working there. She still says that I have a lot of chelas, I have thousands of people that follow me, and so this is her life. This is someone, his birth name was Noman Safdar. He was a male till he was 18 years old. He is a man. He considers himself still a man. He says that I chose this life as a career option. And so that was a big, I know it's time to stop. And I still have like this stuff. Can I summarize it a little bit and finish?
Take another.
Okay. So Noman Safdar, basically, he wanted to become a Khwaja Sara. He wanted to become this so that he can have the wealth of the other Khwaja Saras that were there, to have that curse and word effect. And so that's why he became this. He worked a normal job before this, and then he was like, I can't do this. It's not as gratifying, or it's not making me as wealthy as I could be. So that was an interesting perspective that I had a chance to speak with. And he was so candor. He was his candor was very impressive, that he was so honest about why he was doing this. And now he works as a prostitute, and he works as an entertainer. The next slide, this is where he lives. So you can see Bobby House, and you can see where he's starting. The next, politics, they have a third option, but that third option is so progressive that under that third option, they have three other options. They have either they can identify as transgender male, they can identify as intersex, or they can identify as transgender female. So I thought that was very progressive in the politics of it, that if they're going in, they have not just the other option, but three options under the other section. This is the lawyer that I spoke with, and if you look at this is in a street where it's right behind a hospital where the intersex community doesn't have a ward. They don't have a ward to go in and get medical attention. But here, the street is the organization that Bindia Rana runs. She's ran for parliament, and she said, I ran, and that is my win. I'm not running to win. Me running is winning. And so her poster was that. This is her organization. They have IDs within themselves. So if you still need your parents' IDs to make an ID in Pakistan, so if a parent has disowned their child, they get this ID made to interact with one another, get help if they're in a situation. I just go to this one right here, or yeah. This is basically Sapna. She wrote a book, which is very progressive. If you have questions about it, please do ask, because this is something that is very interesting. Intersex in Islam, this was something that I wanted to focus on. Religiously, in Islam, a person can be transgender. They're against homosexuality, but they have a lot of rights for transgender individuals, which is very surprising to me. And so, to sum it all up, human rights are not, in the long list of human rights in Pakistan, this issue is the least concerning for them, politically, religiously, or socially, and it's dismissed as like a buzzing fly. So.
I'm Siyona. I just graduated from the University of Pennsylvania in May, and I spent the last 3 months in India working on my project. So I began my project as kind of an investigation into how the legal status of queer and trans individuals extended into their daily lives. So currently, the legal status and the laws are contradictory and ambiguous at best. In 2014, the Supreme Court ruled that the third gender would be recognized, but then the third gender, meaning you could mark other, you could mark yourself as a trans individual. But the year before that, there was a ruling, they reinstated a British-era law that criminalized sodomy. So it said that any act of carnal intercourse against the order of nature would be criminalized. So we could go on for ages about the absurdity of trying to govern the order of nature, but what this means for trans individuals is that you're legally recognized. So if you were to ask any government official, they'll say, we support transgender people. But there's still this risk of Penal Code 377, which criminalizes sodomy. So that's often used against LGBT organizations as well. So it's very rarely charged, but the threat is always there. So my question was, what does this mean for individuals when the law is in flux? Like, what does this mean for their daily lives? Oh, this is the wrong computer. So this is Shintu. She is a trans woman, an activist, and the child of a sex worker. She's involved in Anandam, which is a queer organization that was born out of a sex workers union in West Bengal. She makes a living as a dancer in weddings and various festivals. I spent a lot of time with Shintu and other members of Anandam, and they shared a lot of stories about violence that they faced. They described really brutal stories of police brutality as well as just violence from their neighbors. And for a while, I thought that this was it. Like, this was how the law plays into their daily life. Like, there's a cycle of abuse, there's a cycle of fear of reporting this violence to the police, and then it just kind of keeps going. And that was, at first, what I thought that these laws meant. And violence is definitely a formative part of the trans identity. But as I spent time with Shintu on my way to all these interviews, like just in the trains and buses with her walking through the city, I could see that there's a whole part of the identity that's shaped by the context that she's in that the law can never cover. And that's not really surprising that there's a gap between our everyday experiences and laws. But sure enough, when I came back, just the week when I came back from India, the Supreme Court ruled that everyone in the country has the right to privacy. And so this was seen as a really big win for the queer community because for years, civil rights groups have been talking about using the right to privacy as a way to strike down that law, saying that the government can't govern your orientation and your sex life. But this was really interesting for me because after spending all this time with these people, you kind of realize that privacy, not just for trans people, but for people living in poverty in India, is not really accessible. Like, no one really has private space. People live out their lives on the street. Even trying to meet with a partner has to be in a public space, but in hiding. You're living in joint family homes. So this idea of privacy, that's a commodity that only the elite have. So what does that really mean for trans individuals? So I was trying to look beyond this victim narrative of violence and beyond this like mainstream idea of privacy as this right that we all have. So what does it mean for these people every single day? So I visited Shintu in her home in a small town bordering Kolkata, and there I was really struck by how kind everyone was. We would walk through the town. She lived like right in the middle of a red light district, but we'd walk through the town and everyone was really warmly greeting her. They'd say hi. They knew her because she'd been there for so long. And of course that took a lot of time. It wasn't like she was just accepted right away. But there was something about that small town and people being exposed to her all the time that led to this kind of warmth. So this is her in her house doing household work. Next to her is her sister. Her family didn't want to be photographed, but she told me stories about how when she was younger, her mom, who passed away a few years ago, would beat her for doing anything that was feminine. So if she would help with household chores, that was seen as like a really feminine thing for her to be doing. Sometimes she would wear her mom's saris or wear makeup and dance, and if she was caught doing these things, she was brutally beaten. But here she was, after her mother's passing away, doing the kind of feminine household chores. Of course, there were still some differences where her aunt and sister would wear a sari, but she would still kind of dress androgynously. But at the end of the day, these kind of surface level divisions aren't as evident in these homes that she's staying in these spaces. So generally there was this acceptance of the ambiguity that comes with her identity. So I spent a lot of time with Shindu on public transportation. We would take trains and buses all across the city. And in India, for the most part, most trains and buses are divided by gender. So there'll be a sign that says gentlemen's and a sign that says ladies. If it's a really crowded day, no one cares, and you're kind of just squished in there, no one follows it. But on more quiet days, people generally sit separated. When I was with her, she always sat in the gentlemen's section. Sometimes I would sit with her there too, but that is not the same thing. And no one was ever violent towards her when I was there. And she says that over time that's gone down. But there were definitely a lot of stares. But the really significant part about her choosing to sit in that section, I've seen her in protests, I've seen her do her advocacy work where she's very proud. But at the end of the day, these kinds of decisions she's making where she's just choosing to sit on one side of a bus isn't always about that symbolic step. It's just a matter of survival. So that's another level of how these decisions they're making every day in these spaces are kind of policed by the signage and the people watching them. So again, when we were walking in the city I found was much more hostile than this rural area where I just kind of assumed that because they're more conservative, they would be less accepting. But we'd walk around a lot. People wouldn't bother her, but there was a lot of kind of uncomfortable staring. She was great and would just kind of walk up to those people and ask for directions. And I asked over and over again, are you okay with me taking a picture of you? This is drawing attention. We can just drop this. And she was like, no, let's do this. I feel great posing in front of these people. Please keep taking pictures. She would it was great. But in the beginning, I thought that was just a kind of level of confidence that she'd built. And I was like, this is amazing. But it's also this kind of resilience that comes over time. It's just, again, a method of survival, but it was really amazing to watch her. Okay. I will skip this one. This was just a nice moment. She kind of hit it off with the shopkeeper and definitely did not want me to take any more pictures, but that was nice. So this is Raj. This is another gay man in Anandam. They're just good friends. And I've spent a lot of time with both of them, and through just the 3 months of them getting used to me taking pictures, talking to them, they would get more comfortable with each other in public, and even just putting his hand on her is kind of a radical move in the space that we were in. So I could talk to Shintu for hours about really the importance of gaining all these rights, but one day I asked her, I said, okay, so what would you do if 377 was repealed? What would that mean for you? She was like, well, I think that would mean that I could just have a real relationship. It's so hard to pursue relationships because everything's in secret or it's, everything's just defined by the spaces that we're in. And she was using all this terminology that I had been using trying to understand privacy. But she talked about just wanting to hold her partner's hand in public and then be with her partner in private. And so even her understanding is kind of ambiguously divided between public and private. But it's also just such a simple thing to want. And there's such systems working in place that are against that. So on one of my last weekends there, Shindu and a bunch of other members of Anandam planned a queer cafe. It was kind of I don't want to use the word pop-up event because it wasn't that millennial kind of thing, but it was just a really, really nice event that the members of her organization planned. And it was really significant because there's a lot of queer cafes in the city that are kind of thrown by scholarly activists, and the people that go are educated, wealthy enough to know that these events are happening. This was significant because most of these people in the picture are sex workers in the community, but they don't have the access to enter those spaces. They don't even have the ability to have those levels of conversation, even though it's really important to them too. So they planned this event themselves. They cooked all the food. They were able to sell their work, and they were able to put on the dance performances for an audience that wanted to watch them in a way that they've never had the chance to before. So this kind of ownership that they had over the space that was open to the public was, again, really gratifying to watch, and it was just amazing to see her performance at the end kind of erupted into a whole dance party. But what I found really challenging about all of this was trying to capture a lot of these like intangible moments. It's so easy to just kind of give you a slideshow of the violent things that have happened to all of these people and say, this is what it's like for these people. I know that a lot of they were born, like the group was born out of a sex workers union, so their whole approach to social justice is coming from movement framework. We're not victims, we are empowered, we're trying to gain rights through our own mobilization. And so it's really hard to realize how much power you have when these people are sharing different types of stories with you, and it's hard to kind of figure out how you even want to tell that story, which I know is something that we're all kind of dealing with, but just like how to tell their story without feeling like I'm exploiting it and telling it in the way that they want to tell it, while still trying to make it communicable to a Western audience was really hard, and my time is up. Okay, thank you.
All right, so this past summer, I returned to Jordan, a country I had returned to once 2 summers ago, actually, to study Arabic and to work on a refugee resettlement program that we had started in my university. And it was this summer, 2 summers ago, that my project that I did this summer was actually birthed. Certain things that were glaringly obvious to me in the country would become the fundamental nodes of inquiry for my short series this summer. So for instance, Aman, which is pictured here, much like any other city, is a city of haves and have-nots. But what is unique about Aman is that class divisions, or the line that arbitrarily divides the city between east and west, so often manifests itself in a nationalistic division. So you have Jordanians and Palestinians who are more well-off, carrying on their lives in the western part of the city. But what we've seen in the last few years is Syrians who have been lucky enough to even make it to the capital, a city that is rife with labor and industrial opportunity, living in what can only be described as temporary settlements in the eastern part. And obviously that's a generalization, but you get the idea. Secondly, the massive influx of Syrians since 2012 meant that political anxieties were certainly pronounced, combined with massive influxes from Sudan, from Libya, from Iraq. And what this meant was that an individual's own marker of his own identity, whether he was Jordanian, Palestinian, or Syrian, was all the more important. So I left 2 summers ago with, with 2 beliefs, that identity mattered, but more importantly, that Syrian identity in Jordan would be at the forefront of political discourse in the region, but also internationally. So why does all of this matter, right? Why does the Syrian migratory wave matter to us, and why did I devote 2 months of my life to study the phenomenon? Well, first of all, unlike many in this field, I refute the notion that Syrians will eventually return to their home country. There's this tendency in academia to say that there's something special about being Syrian that will lead Syrians to go back to their country. This is certainly not true at all, especially in Jordan. And there are many reasons for this, right? So there are many reasons for this. So first of all, the purely practical reason is that 85% of registered Syrian refugees in Jordan are actually outside the refugee camp, which is something unheard of in Western media, which so often perpetuates this humanitarian porn. And so this means that these families are leading stable lives. Some of them have found work. Some of them have been living in homes for 5 years. And as part of a fascinating phenomenon, they've given birth to the first generation of Syrian children who will know no other country than Jordan. So I argue that on some practical level, there's very little incentive to uproot themselves and make the often perilous journey back to their home country. Secondly, it will take decades to rebuild Syria, right? And we've seen this in Iraq. I mean, after the invasion of 2003, we got to a point about 2 weeks ago where we were able to believe that Iraq had now developed a modicum of stability, right? But last week shows otherwise, and the modicum of stability I mentioned is simply an illusion. So related to this is the demographic of the Syrian refugee in Jordan. Jordan was a Sunni monarchy that was all the more very sympathetic to the revolution, and in fact funded militias in southern Syria. So this meant that refugees who were coming from Syria had a certain political disposition, right? They were coming from cities like Homs or Aleppo, or cities in southern Syria like Dara, cities that formed the initial hotbeds of revolutionary activity in the Civil War or in the Revolution. So, in fact, a story I worked on about 2 Syrian refugees who became citizen journalists. In fact, they were working in Jordan to uncover the injustices Syrians were facing in the country. They mentioned to me that as long as the same deep state that the Assads had institutionalized in Syria was in practice, returning back would not only constitute a death sentence to their lives, but would constitute a death sentence to their families' lives. So this is a very real component of why Syrian refugees from Jordan simply don't have it, or don't have the capacity to return to Syria. So thus far, I've attempted to prove why Syrians from Jordan will not go back, right? There's the pace of reconstruction, there's the sectarian dynamic, and the fact that many Syrians are actually now leading stable lives in Syria and have been there for about 5 years. So what does this mean? It means that on a policy level, Jordan will have to dictate what the terms of long-term integration looks like. And I contend that Jordan's done a very bad job of this thus far. Fragmented communities and a lack of a cohesive national identity is simply not sustainable, right? And we see that the regime knows about this, because walking around the streets of Aman, you'll see young men wearing shirts with the logo of the regime, or on the back of the cars, you'll see the sticker of God, Country, King. So there is a very real attempt to create a national identity, but so far it hasn't worked for the Syrians who've been there for about 5 or 6 years. And perhaps the most glaringly obvious example of this, which lends credence to the notion that the regime has failed to develop long-term integration mechanisms, is in the education sector itself, which is very surprising and shocking, because millions of dollars from the State Department and millions of dollars from NGOs would lead one to believe that by now Jordan would have long-term integration mechanisms in place for Syrian refugees, particularly in education. But such is obviously not the case. I think it was Malcolm X who once said that education was your passport to the future. And while he talked about that phenomenon in terms of America's highly racialized society, this is certainly applicable to Syrians in Jordan. So Syrians are allowed to go to public institutions for elementary education, for secondary education, but surprisingly, the government says you're not allowed to attend public institutions for higher learning, which is paradoxical, right? Because this means that Syrians who have done all that they're supposed to do, who have passed high school, are left with 2 options. They can pursue a scholarship abroad, numbers of which are dwindling, or they can pursue private education in Jordan, which is often, from a financial perspective, an unachievable reality. As I mentioned before, this is an odd policy, because what we've been seeing is that Syrians have the potential and are putting in the effort to graduate, and they do. And part of this is that all students in Jordan have to take a final year exam, which is what the story is about. The exam is called the Tawjihi. Now, the Tawjihi works in an interesting way. The better you perform in the exam, the more likely you are to pursue fields like medicine or science or engineering. So this is a paradox, right? The need to pass the exam is certainly high, but the opportunity to use that exam as a gateway into higher education is simply non-existent. So I was fortunate enough to tell the story of this young woman, Isra Hamad, whose name has changed for her own security. She actually spoke to us over the phone because she was fearful that her husband would find out that she was speaking to the press. She mentioned to me that her family spent over $1,000 to study for the exam, right? The passing grade for the exam is 44%, which means that families all across the country are spending thousands of dollars to prepare. Now, Isra, who was schooled in Syria, where the curriculum is entirely in Arabic, didn't know a lick of English for the exam. So she spends $850, passes the exam, but then can't pursue higher education, right? Because she can't find a scholarship, and education in Jordan at a private institution is just not going to happen. So she gets married at the age of 21, and she wanted to study Islamic law. She wanted to study the Sharia. But one thing that she mentioned to me was that if there's one thing she would be doing instead, it would be school. But now instead, she talked to us about the 4 or 5 kids she wants to have with her husband. And I want to make it clear that while it may seem like this was her choice, I think it's important not to disassociate the role society, the Jordanian government, and her family played in making that choice for her. So what does this mean for Jordan in the long run, right? And why did I decide to cover her story? It means that, well, first of all, according to some, it's easy to talk about, well, we're seeing the emergence of a lost generation in Jordan, and that's certainly true, but a lot of Western scholars will jump to, well, this might increase radicalization, and again, that's part of the humanitarian porn discourse, it's part of the sensational tendencies of Western academics and journalists to say everything is related to terrorism. But what is interesting about Jordan is that that's not really a problem right now. It certainly will, it might be in the future. But as of right now, what we're seeing is an increase in hate speech that is oftentimes sanctioned by the government against Syrian refugees. So Syrians are in an interesting dilemma, right? If they do well in society, they're perceived as leeches, taking away resources from an already resource-poor country. Or if they don't do well, and if they're unemployed, they're perceived as lazy, and again, as taking away resources from a resource-poor country. So the dilemma is a hard one to be in. So this means that if Syrians are not given equal opportunity in education, which I believe is the most important component of long-term integration, then what we're going to see is this crystallization of a nationalistic conflict within Jordan, something we've already seen in communities outside of Amman, right? If you go to northern Jordan, Mafraq, which is a town comprised of a huge number of Syrian refugees, that conflict is certainly there. Or if you go to the south, that conflict is also there. But I fear that if the government does not do enough to combat this issue, that conflict will manifest itself in the capital sooner rather than later. And one thing I do want to say before I wrap up is that the emergence of this lost generation is certainly tragic, right? And the fact that Syrians are having to redo or reshape their lives to live in a country that is entirely foreign to them, and believe me, it's entirely foreign. As being in the West, it's easy to say, well, Syria, Jordan, what's the big deal? There's a big deal. But what is all the more tragic, kind of from a broad peripheral level, is the fact that as journalists, as all of us in this room who've covered some sort of crisis, this whole past weekend has, there's been a theme that I've picked up on, is that sometimes we've become so immune to conflict, and sometimes war, famine, and massive displacement has just become normalized within our conscience. And something that I learned this past summer was it's easy to get caught up in this, I'm gonna get this story, and when I publish it, I'll be really happy and I'll make not enough money at all, and everything will be great. But what we forget sometimes, and certainly what I forgot sometimes, is that the lives of people, like Isra's life, was a real life, and that after my story was published, her life would remain real. So I want to end on that note, and I want to let that serve as a reminder as we go forward and write more stories, that the lives of people that we cover are important and are real before we publish our story, and will remain real after we publish it. So thanks.
Yeah. Hi everyone, my name is Esohe. I'm a recent graduate from the University of Michigan, and the title of my project is No Somos Escondidos, or We Are Not Hidden. And but while it's getting set up, I just have a basic question for you all as well. Helps wake you guys up. First thing is, when you think about Cuba, what do you think of?
Cigars.
Cars and cigars. Okay. What else do you think about?
Fidel.
Fidel. Okay.
Shay.
Jay, yeah. Motorcycle Diaries.
Sanctions.
Yeah, sanctions, baseball. Okay. Probably some rum too. But do you think about the Afro-Cuban population and how they're working online to create a presence for themselves and direct their own narrative? Or the LGBTQ community, specifically trans sex workers, who have made grassroots movements within Cuba and have gotten the support and backing from the Cuban government, specifically with Mariela Castro, Raul Castro's daughter, and they've been able to make progress in the sense that their hormones and sex reassignment surgery is now included and covered by the health care that is offered there. So as a small backstory behind my interest in this topic and my initial plan, I'm a Spanish and communications major. And at the University of Michigan, we spend a lot of time, or at least in the comm department, we spend a lot of time focusing on how digital media is transitioning and shifting but how social movements work and create their own organizations and platforms online. specifically in terms of slacktivism. So when you share something or you retweet it, are you working towards making a difference, or are you just another voice that's not actually moving towards a specific change? When I came across my Cuba topic, it was because I was taking a digital media course, but also a film course on Latin American movies, specifically in Chile, Cuba, and Peru. And within Cuba, we looked at displaced citizens, and out of all of the citizens that I noticed, the ones that were displaced the most, in my opinion, were the Afro-Cubans, because not only were they weren't present within any of the films, and we didn't talk about them at all in the class. So I went to the internet and decided to look up, is this the case within Cuba as well? Spurring my plan to look at how social movements that were happening within the US, such as the Women's March and Black Lives Matter, how has that transcended over into Cuba? As I was doing this research, I realized that was pretty biased of me to assume that there would be a carbon copy of what was happening in the United States would occur in another country as well. And I found out that that's not necessarily the case. So within Cuba, at least with the LGBTQ community, they work predominantly offline, mainly because they have support from the government. So as I mentioned, the trans population has a lot of they're very heavily supported in terms of getting access to hormones and having their rights recognized, but there's still an issue with transphobia. At the same token, there's a big problem with, like, same-sex marriage is still illegal, and homophobia is also still a problem within the country. On the other hand, with the Afro-Cuban population, as I was noticing while I was reading and learning more about the community, they work online mainly because within Cuba, people who would technically be identified as Afro-Cuban choose not to identify themselves as Afro-Cuban, predominantly because Cuba has a sense of first we are Cuban and then you can be whatever else, but also there's still racism. So after the revolution, Fidel Castro had put out a statement saying that we've gotten rid of racism. There isn't a problem with that. There's no issue. But how can you get rid of a feeling that somebody may develop or has an innate aversion to somebody that looks different from them? So a lot of Afro-Cubans will choose to identify themselves as being strictly Cuban, or they're mestizo, which would give them higher access, and or they will say that they are white, even though their phenotype would show them as not being the case. And this is predominantly because by identifying as a white Cuban, you have access to economic advantages. A lot of the communities who fled Cuba before the revolution and during were white Cubans, and so they were able to develop their own e-commerce and businesses outside of Cuba, but also within, and send money back to their families. And as a result, those Cubans were able to progress further, while Afro-Cubans sort of lag behind. And this is currently still the case as Cuba has a two currency system. And so one of the things that I hope to look at is how exactly are Afro-Cubans in the LGBTQ community defining themselves and working within these constraints. For Afro-Cubans, is the problem, are they mainly working online because nobody in the real world, so to speak, chooses to identify as being Afro-Cuban, therefore you have to build your own community or a platform and have other people find that issue and create a safe space, so to speak, before you can act publicly? Or are they just waiting to see what's happening within the government? And this is something that isn't the case for the LGBTQ community, who's acting offline with marches and what have you. And I'm very excited to see what will happen when I leave in December, and how some of the people that I've researched currently are moving forward their own goals when I leave in December. So thank you.
So if everyone wants to come back and take a seat, we'll have some Q&A. Oh, okay, we can share them. Are there only two? Okay. Malaya?
This is actually more common. I just wanted to say how impressed I was by all of your presentations and the topics. So interesting, so well done. I was wondering how each of you found these stories and became interested in them. Just really briefly.
Yeah, I can go. So, as I mentioned, Spanish and communications major, and I love film. And the fact that I noticed that Afro-Cubans weren't being represented in film spurred me to want to look up more about them. But also, while I was taking my class, the women's march had happened. And so, as I was looking up more about Afro-Cubans, I was curious to see how women were moving within this movement as well. And also, how did they connect with the queer community? I'm all about intersectionality, and so trying to see where those two groups would intersect is something that I'm hoping I can see more about, but at the moment, they're working in very separated lines. Yeah.
Other questions? Oh, other people are making questions.
I can go. I became interested in refugeeism simply because my family is comprised of refugees. My grandparents, both sides, were refugees from Pakistan after partition. And trauma is not something that we necessarily have to experience, but it's carried over for generations. So that was always, it runs deep in my blood, the idea of being a refugee and what that means and what identity is. And I guess being, aware enough of the world and seeing how mostly Western media had made this binary between refugees and refugee camps, the picture of a small Syrian child with a dusty face, or on the opposite end, entirely xenophobic rhetoric. It made me, want to do something about the majority of refugees who are just like us, middle class, lower middle class, some of them, who lead stable lives, but what is their identity like, and what does integration look like for them? A story that has been mostly uncovered since the start of the Syrian civil war. So.
Is this on? Okay, so I had done research on the sex workers union that the group is based on in school, and and I was really interested in their approach to women's empowerment and social change through labor organizing, as opposed to a lot of the standard anti-trafficking NGOs that were in the area. So I was already kind of exposed to the group through that. And then graduation was coming up, and I didn't have any plans. So I was still in touch with some of the people that had worked there, and so they were wanting to work on an advocacy project. So I kind of took that opportunity to work with them on a campaign to talk about Penal Code 377. But through my work helping them, I started to realize that there's so much more to it than just that. So it's kind of two projects working on this, as well as helping them in their advocacy campaign.
My parent, is it on? Is it working? I'm just going to use Aman's mic. My parents are from Pakistan, so that was from the beginning, I knew that I would get access into a topic better in Pakistan. There are so many other topics that are underreported, but the transgender community specifically, I studied Islamic studies for a number of years, and so I wanted to know more about, because imams or religious priests and stuff don't speak about the transgender community, and they have rights because they're human beings. So I just wanted to know why it's not spoken about, or why they're not mentioned in the Friday sermons, and my friends weren't really particularly helpful in encouraging me to go, because they were like, how are you going to speak to them? It's a taboo to speak to them or approach them, or you ignore them when you're in a rickshaw at a traffic stop, and you're just you give them money and that's it. And so I wanted to know more about how they lived, how they prayed, how they advocated for their rights, because it's something that I didn't mention, because the things that I found shocking were that they could get married in Islam. They could get, they had rights more specifically than what politics allowed them, or what political legal laws allowed them. So that was something that I wanted to explore more, and that's why I did the project.
Do we have other questions? Yes. Poonam and then Anwar.
Yeah. So, Rubab, I'm really curious. So the Khwaja Sarah community, is that the name?
Yeah.
Is it sort of a parallel to sort of the Hijra Kinder community?
Yes. So Khwaja Sarah is when I spoke to a lot of transgender individuals in the Khwaja Sar community, they basically said that hijra is another term that they use, but it's basically synonymous with saying Khwaja Sara. I think it's more respectful in a way to say Khwaja Sara because the term does originate from India, and because Pakistan and India very overlapped. So the Khwaja Sara basically were guards for royal women, and so that's where the term Khwaja is actually a very respected term. We have in India Khwaja Gharib Nawaz, where there's so many people that go to his shrine. So Khwaja is a good term, but Khwaja Sara, when you look at it, there is a stigma around it. There's a taboo that people get all conscious about speaking about it. But the term hijra is same as it's the same community, but in a more disrespectful term.
On that note, so you talk about how it's sort of been like a culturally sanctioned position that historically has had like huge value. Can you talk about how that's a little bit shifted? I mean, we saw it a little bit in your presentation, but I'm really curious as to.
Yeah, historically, they were kind of. They had a place in society. They were integrated. They weren't segregated. There wasn't a stigma around it. But culturally, I feel like people. I was speaking about this earlier. The westernization or the inclination to become westernized in Pakistan, especially in like urban areas like Karachi, they've started to move away from like the dancing or even thinking about Khwaja Sara people and more of like thinking of themselves like. They'll focus on like women equality and like women empowerment, but then in those issues it kind of gets left out, the transgender community especially, and so not a lot of people are focusing on it. And so culturally they used to dance, they used to go to events, they used to have this kind of life, but now they're not doing it anymore. As when you saw the video about Sonia, we asked her if you liked to dance at events rather than like, beg on the streets, and she was like, dancing was a more respected thing for me rather than like doing sex work or, being out on the roads. That was something that was done. But culturally, people are shifting away from that. And so not just shifting away from their dancing or their inviting them to their homes for events, but also shifting away from just even thinking about them or they're very easily ignored at different points, not just anywhere. Like at the Friday sermon, nobody speaks about it. Nobody in the mosque, they're allowed to pray inside of the masjid, right behind the men in front of the women, but they don't. Why? They have to get the appearance of becoming a man just to go inside the mosque because of people's perceptions. It's not what is actually, that's the shift. Hopefully that answers your question.
I think Amber had a question.
I was also going to ask you about the question, so I can ask her later.
Okay.
All of you guys are doing kind of work that challenges perceptions about things that people haven't really thought about. Was there anything that you guys came into with perception that changed through your reporting, like yourself?
Should I start? The perception that I had was that I did not, what I perceived was that religiously they didn't have a lot of rights. That's what my perception was. Because, Islamic scholars can be a little bit homophobic, kind of, or even against homosexuality, which is in their principles or whatever. But and in the Sharia and the law, the Islamic law. But because of that, I thought that transgender individuals will also be under that umbrella, but it wasn't that case, and so that was my perception, which I was found that it's not the same.
So I guess I talked about this a little bit, but for me, I just kind of expected in the big cities for there to be more progress and for it to be more progressive, and the rural areas to be more conservative. But I was talking to, because there's this legal recognition of trans people, the government has these trans welfare boards throughout different states. They're kind of just like tokenistic. They're not really doing anything yet. They're just kind of like bureaucratic stamps of progress. But I was talking to a hijra that was on the board in West Bengal, and she had worked with a lot of people to actually open up wards for trans people in the rural areas. So there was about 4 hospitals in the rural areas of West Bengal that had trans wards, but that didn't happen in the city. And Kolkata is known for being a very left progressive city, and so that was kind of my surprise to see that sometimes the change, and even police officers. So we met with police officers in the rural areas who we're actually like really open to this movement, and we're really open to being like learning about trans people. But in the cities, that's where more violence was occurring, more police brutality was occurring. And so I guess I just kind of have that mindset that cities are more progressive and rural areas are not. But in terms of like really trying to create change with the people that are outside of the community and opening dialogue, it seemed to be that the rural areas were easier to start that just because you're dealing with these people in a closer proximity to them. So that was a shift that was surprising for me.
Want to take a stab?
Yeah, wow, that's loud. I think in terms of geopolitics, when I came to Jordan, there was this tendency for me to think, okay, Jordan has carried a lot of the weight in terms of refugee resettlement and has done actually a very good job of taking in refugees and providing them with resources. But being there for, like, if you're there for 2 weeks, and even if you're not familiar with the country, it's easy to kind of pick up on the fact that that's just not true at all, right? The sad truth is that obviously the illegitimate Syrian government doesn't care about the Syrian refugees, but neither does Jordan, right? I mean, this is a means to an end. You absorb refugees only enough to get the next check from the State Department or from the US or from other NGOs. But also kind of taking it a step further is the fear that is so palpable within the Syrian community. I talked about the Syrian citizen activists who had become journalists in Jordan, and one of them, whose name I'm not going to mention, is actually wanted by Europol, I think, or by Interpol. That's the organization. But beyond that, he mentioned to me that the work that they do, the mukhabarat, while it gives the appearance of being a benign autocracy, has actually ramped up the amount of deportations back to Syria. So it's a very perilous situation to be in. The appearance is that Jordan's done a very good job, but in fact, the mukhabarat, the deep state, it may give the appearance of being benign, but it's it doesn't want Syrians in the country at all. So.
Well, and you have not been to
Yeah,
Cuba,
I haven't
so
left
don't
yet.
know if your perceptions have changed.
Well, for me, at the moment, I'm very surprised in the way my two topics don't necessarily intersect as well as I thought they would. So being Afro-Cuban and also having, identifying as a part of the queer or LGBTQ community. And it would appear that both of those groups don't necessarily coincide, but where they do intersect is in terms of economics and who has access to what and how you get treated within society based off of how you identify.